Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth and final conversation in the Island City Lab's Water is Life webinar series. And this one is titled Regenerative Food Systems Lessons for Cities. So we're going to get started with some introductions and then get into the panel discussion. As usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get around to them, hopefully all of them in the end of the conversation. So for those of you who are new and joining us for the first time in these webinar series, the Water is Life series, we've been tackling the most critical challenge facing island cities right now, which is, of course, preparing for and adapting to climate change. So the recent IPCC reports projects declining rainfall, more severe droughts, and more intense hurricane season. So water security is and will be the defining issue for all Caribbean islands. And in each of these webinars, we intend to explore the scale of this problem and identify locally relevant solutions that can help us deal with our new climate reality. So today we are going to acknowledge the impact of climate change and water insecurity on our food systems. So frequent droughts and periods of flash floods have and will continue to result in things like crop failures and declines in livestock. So this is usually followed by food price increases and food insecurity for, of course, the most vulnerable in our population. So with this conversation, we're going to ask questions around what is regenerative agriculture and the ways in which that can improve food security in our cities. We're also going to ask how can our cities encourage more regenerative principles? And finally, what could a regenerative Caribbean city look like? So my name is Doreen Duncan. I am the founder of Island City Lab. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a Caribbean-based urban planning think tank dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. So our aim really is to improve our built environment by building, fostering, and convening a network of civic thinkers to confront these challenges. And of course, this conversation is a part of our programming. So today we're going to speak with three exciting experts, enthusiasts, and practitioners of regenerative agriculture and regenerative systems. First, we have Rajay, human being, presently focused on examining ways of human being. He's also a poet, if you can't tell. We have Martin Ford. He's a consultant working on climate resilience in island environments. Martin is a certified sustainable building advisor and is a trained environmental resource management. Is trained in environmental resource management. Martin holds a master's in geography and environmental studies from the University of Toronto, where his research explored sustainable transitions for island environments. We also have Earl, who considers himself a global citizen. Born and raised in Kenya, lived in Canada, and now in the Caribbean. He spent the past 25 years practicing and teaching permaculture on his farm, Wasamaki Ecosystems in Trinidad. He, like Rajay, is trying to figure out his role as a human in the ecosystem he's a part of. And I think we're all trying to do that with this conversation. So again, thank you all for joining the conversation. As questions come to you, feel free to just drop them in the chat. So I'm going to, kick it off. Let's get the conversation rolling. So I want to ask, so usually for these webinars, we have a very diverse audience on the call. So let's start off with having you panelists define or describe what you view as a regenerative system. And in addition to that, give an example of a regenerative system that you are a part of or you're currently working on. So with that, I guess I'll kick it over to you first, Earl. Unmute.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
So my name's Earl. I'm based out of Trinidad, and I've been running a farm over there regeneratively. The process that we use is something called permaculture design, where we look at designing sites based around creating a holistic approach to the entire site. So we look at food, we look at water, we look at biodiversity, we look at housing, we look at waste, we look at energy systems. So for the last 25 years, I've been practicing that and teaching it. And across the Caribbean, I've been working with projects that are trying to be regenerative. So by regenerative, we mean, can the site produce more and support more biodiversity on it than needs to be taken off it for humans to survive on it. So we've been using that approach. I'm right now in Barbados teaching a permaculture design, and yeah, anything that's, I'm happy to be in this conversation, and as questions appear, I'm happy to input whatever experiences I have into it. And that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Martin, over to you.
Hi, yes, thanks a lot, Doreen and Earl. For me, I see regenerative as, you know, like really, I take it from like the design standpoint of looking at holistic approaches to projects. So what is, you know, the climate that you're in, but making sure that you can have, you know, a net positive impact on that particular system. And, you know, like I usually work from the perspective of energy. So, you know, utilizing renewable energy, energy saving techniques, but that's only one element of it. In terms of projects, and, you know, right now I'm trying to start with home, right? Like looking at my parents' home and how can I make that regenerative site, but also helping friends and certain clients think through what are the elements to consider with their household or their commercial projects moving forward.
Yeah, Roger.
Thank you. So for me, regenerative can mean different things, and I love that there's a diversity of that, first of all. So I'm not defining regenerative per se, but from my vantage point, I'm explaining how it resonates with me. And so I think of regenerative, first of all, as a quality of something. So something can be regenerative, for example, if it's the balance of the activities in that place proliferates and generates life as a result of the activities. If someone on a land, whether in a city or on a farm or just in a site, is able to increase the life carrying capacity of that space through their interactions naturally. And I think that quality is what's interesting to me right now. I think regenerative is also a feeling state, and doesn't only apply to sort of like the observable matter that's growing, but it's also quite a social and cultural quality that can be aspired to. And then I also think that regenerative describes the ancient and modern awareness that our Earth is regenerative. We have not been importing matter from Mars and Venus. We only get some sunlight mostly. You know, the system, this macro organism that is Earth operates on regeneration. And regeneration is simply the cycle of the transformation of matter and energy that allows life to organize itself into different degrees and different magnitudes of complexity. And so the awareness that regenerative is the name of the game and is latent and assumed in how the Earth operates brings us back into an association with nature, not as something out there where we're like, in nature, this happens. Nature isn't a place. To me, it is the understanding that these systems and forces are at work, and as self-aware beings, we can observe where we are running against the current of that, and therefore the effects of that are visceral and obvious, and we call that degenerative. And we can try to leverage that and organize it in a more effective and even more efficient way, and then we call those things regenerative design, because we've harnessed sort of the intelligence that's all around. And so to me, regenerative is a quality that seeks to integrate elements of that into anything. And agriculture is a focus here, but we can have regenerative economics and land management systems and all manner of stuff. And so for me, regenerative is a quality. And that's the perspective that I think can cut across many things and how I look at things when I try to do things regenerative.
So I think that's helpful, right? You said regeneration is a quality of something, and you talked about regenerative agriculture being the quality of the food production system. But the series has been about water and water systems. What does regeneration or regenerative approach or regenerative systems thinking, like what does that mean when we're thinking about water, water resources, the flows of water, the cycles of water? What does that mean, or what does that really look like? Anyone?
So I'll just take a quick stab since it's sort of where I was. Water is a lovely one to look at because it's something that even kids learn as just changing forms of matter. You know, we're not bringing in water. You know, it's about the degree of balance in a system allows us to sort of focus on something as a problem or not as a problem. And so with water, we can observe that it's an extraordinary regenerative system because even in school, we're just learning about this water cycling through. And so water is a good way to explain that regeneration is sort of the way that this intelligent entity called Earth distributes matter throughout and within itself and touches upon organisms that interact with those various forms of matter. And so that's sort of what I wanted to say there when it comes to water. And then how can we apply that to systems and cities and agriculture? And I don't have all the answers for this one, but I would say is that there are a few things come to mind that apply to any kind of resource. Looking on things as systems and cycles, not as inputs and singular processes. And so oftentimes when I hear of urban planning and discussions around water, water is a resource, and obviously water is a resource. But thinking of water as an input or just as a resource allows us to go oftentimes into a quite macroscopic form of thinking that doesn't see the bigger picture of how water may operate in a broad watershed. And so one of the things that Earl has taught me, Earl is my teacher, by the way, for those who don't know, is the concept of expanding even the perspective of my site to not be how water runs on my site, but how water operates in my entire watershed, because I can't actually distinguish my water and how water flows through my site from how water moves throughout basically its entire watershed, how topography affects that, how stuff upstream affect that. And so what I want to contribute here, and I'm sure Earl and Martin may have maybe more concrete things, is looking at any resource regeneratively oftentimes requires enlarging the perspective and zooming out to observe the forward and backward linkages that apply to where you are on the continuum. And you're always one place on the continuum. And then there are linkages in all directions. And that perspective, to me, is where the regeneration occurs. It's applying that perspective to then observe how what you're doing can synchronize with something that's broader than you, but how your actions affect more than the focus that presently maybe brought you to the conversation. And so that quality and perspective is what's just been on my mind. And so it's kind of like you take any question and you apply forward and backwards linkages, and you think of how this operates in the ecosystem. Your creativity and your own intelligence will produce unique pathways of regeneration for you. And that's what I love about this type of work. It's quite particular.
I think that's very helpful framing. And I love to go to Earl and Martin for specific examples. You know, you mentioned, Earl, that you've been working and being a steward of this farm for a long time. Can you talk about, you know, the kind of concrete manifestations of what Roger is talking about, of regeneration through water systems? And I'd love for you, Martin, afterwards to kind of talk about the different scales. You know, not everyone has a farm, not everyone is working or has access to a big plot of land to experiment with these type of systems. Or what does it mean in your backyard?
Right. So when we talk about permaculture systems, it's really about flows of energy across your site, and water is one of the energies that flows across your site. And in natural systems, the ecosystem tries to slow energy moving through a site so that it can interact with it. The slower the energy moves through the site, the more interaction can happen between the organisms in the ecosystem and that form of energy, which in this case is water. So when we look at water within a built system and we look at using it regeneratively, we're really trying to slow it moving through our built ecosystem as much as possible from a regenerative point of view. From an engineering point of view, most people try to move water very quickly through the built system, so that from the point that it falls from the sky, you are trying to get it out of your environment as quickly as possible. But if you look at a forest system, from the point that it falls from the sky, it is hitting a canopy. The canopy is slowing it. It's condensing into bigger drops. It's falling onto the forest floor, and it's slowly incorporating itself into the forest floor and then into the water table to where it comes out as a spring again. And at all points, it's actually being cleaned instead of being contaminated. So from a built point of view, if we can take that ecosystem approach to water, and how can we slow down water from the point that it falls from the sky? And can we collect it in rain tanks? Can we have living roofs that will filter it as it's coming off the roof and into a tank? And then as we as humans use it, can we acknowledge that we need to keep it clean from our use, or we can use it, but it's still clean after we use it? In which case, can we create systems that will clean it as we use it, so that by the time it goes back into the environment, it's clean again? And there are wetlands and wetland systems that clean it naturally, but can we create little wetland systems around our houses that the gray water that comes off our taps, as it goes through from the point that it's in your sink or in your washing machine and it's being dirtied, can it be also cleaned as it leaves your house into your garden, so that by the time it leaves your garden, it's clean again for someone else to pick up and use as clean? So in regenerative systems, this is how they work, is they keep cleaning the system as they use the energy. And we need to now take our brilliant minds and involve that in cleaning the water as we use it, and cleaning the air as we use it, and not treating waste as something that needs to be dumped somewhere, but more as a resource, something else that will happen around us. And so to be regenerative with water, we have to find ways of using the water for and meet all our needs, like just any other animal in the ecosystem, but not contaminating the water, so that everything else in the ecosystem can use it as well. And to slow it down as it moves through the ecosystem, so that we can use it, we can clean it, and we can put it back. And once we can achieve that, we're regenerative. We have no impact on the resource, but we've used the resource to all the needs that we need, but we've put it back in a clean way. And this is the challenge, and it can be done. And we have the technology around us. It's more of trying to get into the living space now.
Mm-hmm. Martin? You're muted, Martin.
Sorry about that.
No.
Thanks, guys, for that contribution. And to build on what you guys have said, you know, like, I'd like to look at it from, all right, there's certain things that are permanent when it comes to a project site. And for example, you know, we live in the Caribbean, we can't change our climate on a site per se, right? We can create microclimates, etc. If you have a certain plot of land, you know, a certain elevation or slope, you know, you can change some of those elements, but it's a bit harder than, say, water, I find. And I find the reason I like that you guys are starting with water with this discussion is when you see the challenge of, say, climate change framed up, sometimes for individuals that can be seen as such a big, enormous thing. You know, you see these crazy weather patterns happening, you see a lot of inequity that is happening because of such changes, that sometimes it can be rather intimidating, or you have a certain empathy battery for all the craziness that's happening in the world. And I see, when it comes to regenerative systems, I see water as, it's something that not only is it a feature of a site, but it is a communication tool around which you can gather, right? Concretely, everyone knows what it is to have, to need water, and what happens if you don't have it. That's the first part. And then it's something that can elevate discussion and push for regenerative systems and change at a national level or at an individual level, at the household level. And I think that flexibility is what makes the topic and how we deal with it through a regenerative lens very critical. Because now you can talk to persons who, all right, well, I don't have the money to change all the aspect and slope and bring in machinery, but there are things that I can do at an individual level that I'm empowered through my knowledge of how to use regenerative techniques at the micro scale. And it's the aggregation of those techniques that we have based on, you know, our particular climate and landscape and geographic location that have nuances and approaches. And so by aggregating those, we create a culture around regeneration. And I think that's how I like to look at water per se. And it also is some of the motivation for me, starting with my own household, is like out of a frustration sometimes, like I work in climate change, and sometimes it can be mentally tough, especially when we're in a disaster, post-disaster phase, and you're trying to be focused and help. And I think what really got me into this regenerative farming and just exploring these techniques is it was empowering. It was like, this is an instant thing that I can do or explore, build my knowledge on, that can create an impact for my immediate family. And if I share with friends, you know, it isn't always about the business of it. It is a conversation starter, or it waters the levels of playing field, right? Because if a country doesn't have water or food, we got it, right? So it's a very important issue, and it can be spiritual as well, right? The healing for the landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. The kind of optimism that comes with applying regenerative systems or regenerative principles to situations, right? So we've kind of talked about it in an abstract setting. We've talked about it in the context of farms. Jordan and I are urban planners, right? So we focus on cities, right? What are some of the ways that some of the ways that we can apply regenerative principles rather to urban systems? And when we talk about urban systems, we're talking about the systems upon which cities function, right? So water systems, whether that is the distribution of potable water to people, the extraction of wastewater and sewage. What are some of those systems within cities across the Caribbean do you think are kind of areas that we should be looking at more regenerative approaches to managing those urban systems? Can kick off with you, Earl or Roger, whoever had their mic unmuted.
Sure. I'll give one or two, and then for me, more will come to me as others talk. So there are different scales of this. So I'm a really personal, individual scale person. And so I think the first is for people, no matter where they are, to, if they're interested, to choose to come into relationship with their water. That's kind of the first thing to me. I think the healing of, if people talk about healing the planet or healing urban spaces, it's the people. It's not like, it's the individual people that sort of gets aggregated, and systems can support that, but to me it's the people. And so coming into relationship, if you can, with water, your own water, understanding the flow of water in your household or across your site, in your community, that could look like, if you're interested in conservation and redirecting water, exploring greywater systems. Greywater systems are a lovely way, and rainwater harvesting are a lovely way to create slow home scale revolution, by people understanding that as we slow water and move it across a site and have it interact with as much life as possible, water doesn't have like an on and off state of used and unused, or dirty or clean. It can serve multiple functions as it flows, and being able to start to design, even in small ways, how your kitchen flows into a garden, If you want to get more advanced, or your kitchen flows into a garden water filtration system that can flow back around to your toilets. There are many ways that you can play with gray water, but gray water allows for people to do something as simple as a pipe depositing on a slope in the garden and sort of feeding down, and at least starting that ability to actually exploring more systems of natural filtration and complicated setups. But I think at a home scale, gray water and rainwater harvesting together and separately are important, and that starts a change in how we design homes, that we're designing homes for harnessing water that comes naturally from the sky. And in obviously in water scarce environments, this is a given. Look at Bermuda, as you guys well know, there rainwater harvesting is like that's how water is done in many of those places. And so I think at one scale, that's a concrete thing. At a small urban scale, at a larger scale, I know you wanted concrete, but you know I'm an abstract person sometimes. I think the nature of the built environment is one of the few spaces where we destroy living soils, and people think of soil as a growing medium, but at a larger hydrogeological level, or as the ecological level, water is the way that water comes from the sky and gets trapped in the ground. Otherwise, it either evaporates and goes out to the sea, quite in these rushy floods. And so trying to reclaim living soils in urban areas in whatever form that takes, to me is just the design modification that is required for the built environment to not sort of be this strange place where water does not, when water falls on land, it does not go through this porous skin of the earth that the soil is, and replenish groundwater and replenish springs. And this is a direct impact on water security for farms, and how the water level in many cities is dropping. And what that just means is that rural rivers get diverted, like in Jamaica, to feed the urban centers. And it just kind of creates a cycle. And as urban areas expand, the living soil decreases, farming expands, the living soil decreases. And so reclaiming living soils as a larger design perspective, whether it's dealing with large green areas to catch stormwater, as you guys have studied, or designing urban spaces where we're not looking to cover in gray, but we're looking to integrate minimal gray infrastructure with maximal green infrastructure, if we can call nature green infrastructure now, I think is a design perspective for urban areas that can have massive run-on ecological impact. It also changes how we understand the built environment that we can actually construct in a natural, regenerative way that has our feet touching the ground, that has water going down through the ground. And that really is only about 3% of the world's Earth's water is fresh water. And so it's through the soil that happens. And if we don't reclaim that as part of our built environment, we're sort of never really going to catch up.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you. Earl, any thoughts?
Oops. Yes, so some of my thoughts on it, just as this conversation was evolving, was really involving people that design cities. So town planners, engineers, architects, educating them in how an ecosystem works can then inform them on how they can design for a built system, taking knowledge from an ecosystem. And why I bring this up is that I've worked with engineers, and at engineering school, engineers are taught to move water out of the site as quickly as possible. So that when I talk to engineers from a regenerative point of view of how can I slow the water as much as possible as it's moving around the site, that goes against their training, because they're trained to move things out quickly. So and pretty much sometimes we talk about the individual taking responsibility, but sometimes the individual is placed into a built environment already that the architects and the engineers and the town planners have already designed for them to put them in, so that it's very difficult for them to now retroactively fix that site because it's already hardscaped in a way that is difficult to adjust. So we almost need to approach, and this is what I covered in class today, is there is a place in Brazil called Curitiba that for the last, I think, 30 years, they elected a town planner as their mayor. and the mayor made huge changes. And it was different mayors that were elected over the 30-year period, but they each built on the previous mayor's town planning abilities to make the site sustainable. So that culture that is embedded in the city of Curitiba now has that culture of regenerative thinking that doesn't start every 5 years when a new mayor takes over, but continues, as well as now the mayor being a town planner can influence the engineering aspects of that site to make it more regenerative. So it's about educating people outside of the farming activities. Sometimes it's these people that are making big decisions in the landscape and making them aware of how an ecosystem works, and then letting them take that information to inform them how they design the build system. That I think is critical, because sometimes, like I said, you as an individual is placed in a house that just doesn't help you recycle your gray water. While if you are placed in a house that has the systems in place that were designed to behave like a ecosystem or behave like a wetland, then you just have to play your part in it. It's already in there. But it's very difficult sometimes for an individual to go into a housing estate and change the hardscape that's there, because it's just not designed properly for them. So that is also a critical part that I think is teaching ecosystem thinking to a lot of these people that design hardscapes. That at that point, the individual can go in there and know he or she is supported to regenerate, versus them trying to run up against a concrete wall in a way of how they can regenerate in that space. Right?
Yeah. And Martin, I want to rephrase that question for you, because you are operating like me in kind of like a city planning space. You're working on energy systems. You're working with lots of time local governments who are trying to do sustainable things, whatever that may mean. How do you imagine us retrofitting some of these systems, right? So Earl talked about, concrete issues, like that's both, literal and metaphorical, right? Like how do we retrofit some of these systems? In Jamaica, we're talking about flood infrastructure that is primarily through the use of pipes, right? Like how do we retrofit things like that have already these major bits of investment already put in there? How do we start to retrofit all of these systems, both the physical pieces of it and the governance piece of it? And you can answer any piece of that question, understanding as a very big question for you.
No, thanks. Yeah, I'm just synthesizing what Earl and Jay were saying and your question. And I think, having been in, large city like Toronto versus, on an island, and, I found that through my school and professional career, everything I did, I tried to focus on, well, how does this apply to an island environment? And I think building on what Earl said there about really understanding the design and making sure that all the actors are in the space, like that we start to look at what is our process for approval for development of projects more broadly. Because let's use a different frame. Let's look at it as a national security frame, just for a second, right? We want to make sure that we're protecting the people from the effects of bad planning of water. So if there's a disaster, is my landscape designed in a way, or my site designed in a way that is protecting not only myself, but my neighbor, right? And so that what it comes down to, answer your question, is looking at our zoning and our zoning laws and laying on that. What are climate resilient designs for island environments, given our different, topographies or the different geology and hydrology, to ensure that we are not only, one, protecting our people, two, harvesting, managing water on site and on other business sites, and then three, and ensuring that the built infrastructure, you asked about retrofitting and buildings, and that we're protecting our asset, right? So you may find in some instances, I remember when I was doing my thesis research and we were looking at hotels, and sometimes we would build hotels in a location that might not be the best place to put it from water management standpoint, but it had other factors like this is what, people want to be on the beach side. And that's the general thinking of developers, like how I get the most for my money on this particular site. However, we have to make sure that we're not placating to bad practices and designs. Or I don't want to say bad, because over time we've come to, we learn through mistakes, right? It's not pointing fingers at anyone, but I think we're at a stage now in the dialogue where you have serious challenges with changing climatic patterns. Two, we can protect our communities, households, and countries with looking at that broad ecosystem planning and establishing those zones and using nature-based solutions for water management to effectively capture the water for different uses. And three, by aggregating this, now we create standards, and we set a standard for the world. And this can, over time, we'll learn, there'll be mistakes, but I think codifying these processes are good at the state level. And so like having seen that happen to varying degrees in different jurisdictions, right? And is looking at urban planning and design and really bringing that into the forefront as kind of the quintessential element that we need to focus and be rigid on sometimes when it comes to investment, right? But yeah.
Thank you for that. And do you have something to add to that, Roger? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to throw a little wrench a little bit.
As you do.
As you know, how it is. And so, and this is an area where it's diversity really not different. Like I agree with everything that said, though it's a little different from my path. And so I'm not inspired to do much retrofitting, though I'm very happy that there are people like you guys who talk about urban planning and would want to retrofit the systems, because one, the sort of like, how do we make something fit? Like it isn't important for people who are invested in the system, but also sometimes doesn't feel as imaginative and inspirational as sometimes the calling can be. And so if I were to think of retrofitting something, I would also retrofit the design principles involved in urban planning, which oftentimes just means centralization. We don't say it, but we say urban planning, and what we really mean is centralization of everything. And I think I would love to see urban planning evolve to appreciate. Excuse me, there's a noise here. Yeah, I'd love to see urban planning move to appreciate decentralized systems. And I think decentralized water resource management systems is a fancy term for kind of just lowering the scale, have emerged a lot more in the urban planning discourse as being able to honor site-specific peculiarities. And oftentimes what Earl is talking about, where it's sort of like people then get foisted upon a design that they can't really change much, is in part because of the paradigm of urban planning, which just enlarges sort of like from the center of power, how the resource management infrastructure of utilities, and just says, okay, continue piping and pumping and moving in sort of like these channels that may not be most appropriate for individual watersheds. And so being able to perhaps change the unit of analysis of how we plan can allow for designing for peculiarities and particularities in areas, and allowing for a resilient buffet or diversity of micro, in energy we say microgrids, in water it's decentralized, but it's kind of like the same thing. Decentralized water management at community scales can allow for many other things to take into account. The case in Jamaica with Manchester, where people wanted to manage the discharge to pump water up the hill, which is the completely energy inefficient way to manage water in a site like that. But if we were to look on managing water in that site, not from the perspective of someone in Kingston trying to get water there, but more about designing how water flows through that topography, then I'm sure a different design would come out. And so while I can't prescribe the design approach and design perspective to me could benefit from much smaller scales. Because I worry sometimes of just retrofitting by throwing green over things, but not changing the entire paradigm of designing over time.
Yeah.
And so I just love to throw that in there as a caution as well in
Yeah.
just greening.
I wanted to piggyback off of that. So you said buffet. So I think two things that you said about the kind of changing the scales that we're thinking about, right? And decentralization being very important. And that when we are focused on the scale of a city, a Kingston, a Montego Bay, or Portmore, or Port of Spain, that we're thinking these massive systems, right? And it kind of blinds us to the fact that lots of these systems are small, right? So, and then I wanted to bring in back the food conversation, right? What does like that decentralization and regenerative approach mean for food systems? Understanding in places like Jamaica, majority of our food is imported, and the food that is grown, it's coming from outside of the city and trucked inside. What does regenerative food mean for people who are living in cities? What does that mean? What does that look like? Either tangibly, like what is actually being done, or more imaginatively? And I'll open it up. I guess, Earl, you want to give us a go?
Looking at regenerative food systems in the built environment, there's a couple of approaches. One is just reducing the food miles. So how close to the city can food be generated? And how can we put a face to the farmer and a face to a consumer where they actually meet each other, so that there's this desire that if the farmer knows who his client is and the client knows who the farmer is, there's less chance of them producing contaminated produce that is going to someone that is faceless. That way you have this connection. And if the consumer understands what the farmer is going through, sometimes the consumer is willing to pay more for a produce. So sometimes connecting the farmer and the consumer is important in a built-in landscape. And by doing that, it's again comes down to design sometimes, is how can you bring farmland further into the city instead of pushing farmers further and further away from the city, as you take sometimes the best agricultural land and turn it into housing, and then expect the farmer to produce food cheaply on suboptimal land because he's been pushed further and further away from where the good land is, which tends to happen a lot in urban areas, where an urban area starts because the land is good, the land is fertile, you grow food there, the community starts right next to where food is growing. And then as the community builds up, it pushes the farmer away to make more housing. And the best farmland is now covered by housing. So it's about acknowledging that and realizing, well, if the best farmland is in the middle of the city, that is where the farmer should be. And it shouldn't be that expensive housing is going there. It should be that that's where the food is growing. So that is when you start looking at things regeneratively. But there are all other options. Is how can you take the organic waste that the built up city is creating, and how can you turn that into compost, and how can you get that to a farmer efficiently? Because a farmer needs nutrients to farm his land to then export the nutrients back into the city. So if there is an exchange, and at this point, there's no exchange. A farmer, if he's not organic, he's going to go and buy fertilizer that's coming from somewhere in the world, while all the good organic waste in the city is going to the landfill. So that we need to design these systems where the organic matter within the city is going back to the farm. And when you realize that your farm is, or your food is coming from your waste that you're sending out, it incentivizes you to keep your waste clean, so that you don't put motor oil with your food waste, because you know it's going to the farm over there and that farm is using it to send food back to you. So it's about creating closed loops in the food systems as well, so that the consumer understands how the farmer is producing, and the farmer is getting the consumer's waste as a resource for him to build his soil to then put back into the food. So it's creating these awarenesses and then creating these loops, which all comes down to people designing ways to do that efficiently. Because if you don't have an efficient design, then it falls apart and everything gets contaminated and it just goes to the dump, or it contaminates the food system. So it's, again, going back to education, going back to design, and then helping people put these things in place to create these closed loops instead of this one-way movement of resources through the society. Hope
Mhm.
that makes sense.
No, definitely. Anyone else wants to comment on that one?
Yeah, I just want to echo on Earl on the elements of design. I mean, and you touched on something, Earl, where, you know, land is being brought up for housing or switched to other uses. And sometimes those uses can be perceived as, sometimes those uses are good as well, right? Like, you know, we see a lot of persons now where they're buying the farmland to put down solar systems, right? And I work in that space. I'm all for renewable energy, but I also see like there has to be at the very beginning stage a real design on how to use and maximize the landscape on which these systems are put, to consider how is the water flowing across the site, like Roger said. Are we, is the land more amenable to growing food? And if it is, how can there be a marriage between these two? In different islands, you know, I've seen even at home in Barbados, where with some of the big solar farms, they have sheep farming. But another stage to that is looking at, well, if, how are we rotating those sheep inside the farm as well? Because if they eat away all of the root structure, you know, like then you're going to have erosion happening around your site, or runoff from your site with this soil into roads. And so how are we creating barriers for that? Or in the case of, you know, like battery storage, like now we're moving to a situation where we're going to have large batteries along these sites as well. Well, if there is a battery fire, what are some of the fire protection mechanisms that are put in place through landscape design? You know, whether that's having water on site, whether that's, you know, making sure vegetation is growing in a certain place or not, to mitigate some of the factors of this great green solution, which will save us money and it will create resilience in one aspect. Because resilience exists on a spectrum when it comes to regeneration. And so it's how these systems interplay, and taking the time, it may be added development costs, maybe 5 to 10% to look at something like that. But the potential long-term benefit outweighs rushing through to develop a project just for the monetary component. Especially in environments like islands where land is limited, like Earl said. So it's like, what are the inputs and what are the outputs for this particular parcel of land based on its characteristics? And whether that's slope, soil quality, what was its history? What was it used for before? Are there, and in doing that research too, indigenous knowledge, you know, like here in recent times, I've seen a big push for engaging with traditional ecological knowledge, right? In the Caribbean, you know, like we have a lot of big projects, and those have a lot of, you know, sometimes we rely on consulting workforce, and a lot of time is needed to engage with local persons who understand and have that relationship, as Roger said, with water, relationship with the land, because they've seen it. It's sometimes histories are oratory and passed down. So you find like in Canada as well, you know, there's a big push in urban planning to look at that TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, engage with the First Nation communities, because a lot of the way they approach planning is through a principle, I think it's called 7G, where what decisions they make for the land have to be done with 7 generations in mind, so 250 years in the future. do we have
Yeah.
that lens, especially in times of economic crisis, right?
I wanted to bring in, sorry to break it, Martin. I wanted to bring
That's
in
okay.
a couple of questions from the chat that I think are very related. So we have someone in the chat, Sharon Jordan, who's asking a very interesting question. How do you sell regenerative farming solutions or principles to small scale farmers who normally are not willing to spend? But also the fact that, you know, oftentimes setting up a regenerative farm, the benefits may be, you know, much further down in terms of time frame. So how do you sell this type of principles, this type of approach to, you know, farming communities in Trinidad, in Barbados, in Jamaica? What is the type of language we're using to kind of advocate for this type of approach for farmers?
So my approach on it, because I do deal with farmers quite often, is to look at their costs. And really, most conventional farming is based on a whole series of inputs that you purchase, which you then apply to your land to get outputs that you then sell. So by analyzing the inputs, if I can show by regenerative agriculture, I can cut down the amount of inputs that you have to purchase, that you can actually produce on site, then that starts the process towards moving towards a regenerative landscape. The first one is costs, because whatever can take out something from the bottom line from the farmer as an expense is something that they will pay attention to, without even looking at the bigger picture of whether you're adding biodiversity or preventing erosion or anything like that. It's really about, how can I offer you a service that will reduce the amount of inputs that you have to purchase for your site, from which point that might allow you to make other decisions that might help you to go down the regenerative pathway. So really the first things is really about getting them to understand also the value of the soil and about the life in their soil, and about increasing the value of having healthy soil and building up from there. And those are the first two approaches, because normally one of the farmers' biggest problems is fertilizer costs, or herbicide costs, or any of those costs. And when you look at it, it's really because the soil is getting more and more depleted that he has to put more and more things, he or she has to put more and more things into it. So by taking the approach, and also what we call the 10% rule is, don't try and convert 100% of your farm to regenerative the first year. Start with 10%, make little mistakes, learn from them, and the following year go to 20%. And then the following year 30%. And if it's working for you, you're gonna want to do that. But and that's where the approach is. And if it doesn't work well, I'm doing something wrong, passing this information on. So we always start small, make small mistakes, get small learning curves, and then build from that. So one is reduce your inputs, get your soil back into condition, and then go from there.
Great. We have another question from Sharon as well, who's from Mauritius, so another island, working on a startup business idea where we buy bio-waste, and someone can, you know, volunteer to define that. We buy bio-waste to compost and then sell to small-scale farmers for organic food supplies. I think this is related to your topic around closing the loops, Earl, right? And I feel like I've heard conversations around this, kind of having composting in places where people are producing lots of waste, so that whether that is at hotels or in cities, collecting food waste or other type of organic waste, converting it into something else, and creating another loop where that waste then has another life in agricultural communities. Could we talk about, you know, just, I guess, general responses to an idea like that, and the need for something like that in any of our island communities?
So I can start the conversation and anyone's free to jump in, but that is something that people are trying and working on, because organic waste can really take up a large percentage of the landfill. And as we know, most Caribbean islands don't have that much space to be piling more and more garbage. So removing organic waste from the stream of garbage that is going into a landfill is critical, because that immediately reduces the volumes. Now, taking that organic waste and now training people to actually convert it into something useful that can go back to a farmer is useful as well, because it will then cause employment in certain aspects. So we really want to also start creating regenerative economic systems, and making compost can be one of those regenerative economic systems, because anywhere that you look right now, and that's from a lot of young people talking to me, is anyone that wants to do regenerative work tends to have to volunteer their life away with no income. While if you want to do degenerative work on this planet, you get paid millions of dollars to do that. And we have to start changing that narrative, that if you want to be regenerative and you want to fix the planet, there should be lots of money for you to do that. And you should be paid well to do that, because you are in service of the entire planet. And if you're doing degradative work on this planet, you should be almost ostracized and not being paid millions of dollars to do that. But that is the conflict that we're in right now, is that a lot of people coming out of UE that have environmental degrees have nowhere to work unless they're willing to volunteer their life away, which doesn't make sense. That's new slavery in a way. So we need to get away from this, and we have to build these regenerative systems that will employ young people to fix the planet instead of employing young people to destroy the planet, which is the direction we're still going into.
Great.
Input.
Thank you. No, that was a super helpful response. I want to acknowledge that we're at time, and I know that people are jumping off, but I do want to give both Roger and Martin one last comment on that question before we wrap up officially, if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Am I frozen? I think I'm frozen, but I'm going to keep talking. You let me know if I'm not frozen.
You're good. You're good.
I'm good. Okay. Yeah. So, I was thinking about the first question about regenerative food systems, and just a few things come to mind. One is reclaiming what food's available. Oftentimes we think of food as growing a very narrow band of crops based on oftentimes colonial histories. And there's so much more food available in our environment, many times growing wild. And we call these past foods, but they were the current foods for many of our ancestors, in these climates. And I think, reclaiming what food is really available in our environment and expanding what we use for food, something as simple as breadfruit, there's so much stuff, I think can allow for regenerative agroforestry to dominate a lot of how we think of farmland. We think of farmland as large expanses that we clear to grow crops, and therefore we need all of this kind of like flat farmland. But if food is an integrated part of our system, generally, then food can be focused in certain areas, but food in our agroforestry system does not need to always be in centralized pockets. And I think if we start to redesign how we think of food production as opposed to an import into a city, but food production being distributed and diverse as it is in nature, there's no farm in a forest, food is just distributed, then I think we can imagine food systems different from farming systems. And that's really where my mind.
Thank you, Froze.
So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah, Martin, last sentence from you.
I agree with Roger on the distributed component. We see it in energy. We see that pattern popping up as one of the most efficient patterns in the world, right? Like most systems, when distributed, have a level of redundancy and resiliency. And so looking at ways to create the efficiency of transporting of goods between sites or between consumer and producer, between farmer and market, looking at the networks that we have for aggregating this knowledge, with more events like this, will help us to flesh out some of the more optimized ways of food production, water management. But it all comes down to like making sure that this resonates with the cultures in which we live, and and really appreciating the indigenous knowledge that exists already, So let's celebrate the successes that we have, or the things and strengths that we have first. And then through that, we earn the right to, critique and criticize. And I guess for me, it's like forming that relationship with water, and to the gentleman, Sharan, forming that relationship with the farmers, where it might not be all the farmers, but you might be able to save one farmer on their resources. Through that relationship, you start to flesh out, like a broader business model, and that goes for any endeavor in regeneration. Ultimately, I agree with Earl, like, if you say you're doing environmental stuff, it's like, oh, you're hugging trees, walking around barefoot, I'm all for that too. But like, this is a critical this is about critical infrastructure, right? And our environment, if you want to frame it in I guess a capitalist type of way, our environments are critical infrastructure. Without it, there's no.
Well said. Well said. Well
It's
said.
not walking around barefoot, hugging trees, all about it.
Someone is throwing words at Roger, but we're all here for it, right?
Oh no, it's not words at him at all.
I know, I'm just joking.
No.
But I want to thank all of you guys, Earl, Roger, Martin. As Martin talked about Indigenous knowledge, I really think with this series, Island City Lab is really trying to bring in as much regional voices who are interested and passionate about these things. And I want to thank all three of you guys for, giving of your time, your effort, your energy to come and spend an hour and a half with us in this conversation. And thank you to everyone else who showed up for the event. We are super happy to have been able to close off the Waters Live series with what I think was a very optimistic sort of conversation, an imaginative sort of conversation. Again, all of Island City Lab's webinars, all of the series throughout, starting from August to now, will be posted to Island City Lab YouTube by the end of the year. Again, thank you all so much for the support, and we look forward to facilitating conversations, more diverse conversations like this again in the new year. If you have not already, follow Island City Lab on socials and sign up for a newsletter. Again, thank you, Earl, Martin, Roger. Everyone, have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Be safe.
Bye.